Okay. So, law of cosines. Separate law. That's a silly statement. It's a different law that uses, obviously, cosines. Now, it's going to become a little bit more complicated today because as we get into the problems, you're going to have to decide, am I using law of sines or am I using law of cosines? Law of sines we talked about already the other day, and that is if you have an angle and a side opposite it. But what if you don't have an angle and a side opposite it? How do you get the problem to be solvable? Okay, so here's a scenario. You'll notice in that triangle down at the bottom, I can't solve that using law of sines because I don't know how long A is. If I knew A, then it's law of sines and I'm done. Life is grand. But I don't, which means I need to convert to law of cosines. Just like law of sines, there's one law of cosines, but there's two different problems. Solving for an angle or solving for a side. Okay, so let's go. Here we go. This is fun. This is fun. There it is. Oh, that's a monster. Okay. Now, because I want you to be able to apply these laws and not just go home and memorize, on the quiz Tuesday, I will give you the law of sines and the law of cosines. So if you went home last night and spent 3 hours memorizing the law of sines, number one, there's something wrong with you. And number two, you don't need to do that because I'll give you these formulas.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Here's the tricky part. Well, there's a lot of tricky parts, but here's the biggest thing to remember. Not every triangle is going to be labeled A, B, and C. So what if it's not labeled A, B, C? The biggest thing to remember with law of cosines is that whatever side I've got over here on the left-hand side has to correspond to the angle that I'm taking the cosine of. Okay, so let's suppose I have triangle XYZ. I have triangle XYZ, and I'm going to solve for the side X. Then it would be X squared is equal to Y squared plus Z squared minus big honkin' bracket 2YZ cosine X. Again, that has to correspond to that. Comprende? See? Okay. So I just gave it to you in one form because obviously there are an infinite number of forms of the law of cosine. Z. Forgot the S on there. Everybody got it? We're good? Let's take a look. First scenario is called the side angle side scenario. It's called the side angle side scenario because I gave you two sides and the angle in between. We're going to start by solving for A. This one's the easiest because you could do the whole problem in one shot in your calculator. Done. Okay? So, two things. One, set it up. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to set up the equation, and then I'll give you a couple more minutes to solve it, but I'm going to set it up with you after a couple minutes to make sure you have it set it up correctly so you don't go down that path that you don't really want to explore. Okay? So, start by solving for A, which is really what we're trying to do. Señor Weber, ¿cómo estás? I'm sorry. What did you need killed? Okay, so, Corey, it's okay, just a question. How did you set it up? I don't want the answer, I just want to know how you set it up. I'll get you started. No subtraction, just multiplication. Notice if I go back, whoops, no, that's not right. If I go back, there's no subtraction there, it's all multiplication. Okay? Now, don't get bogged down in this problem with, well, b is 4, so 4 has to go there, because 4 squared plus 7 squared is the same thing as 7 squared plus 4 squared. 2 times 4 times 7, same thing as 2 times 7 times 4. The thing that has to be corresponding correctly is that 52, because that's angle A, has to correspond to that A over there, which it does. Now, the nice thing about this is you can put that whole monster into your calculator in all one fell swoop. But notice, your calculator, whether you want it to or not, is going to put a parentheses right there. So you're actually going to need an extra set of parentheses. That's about the only thing you have to add, is close that parentheses twice. The biggest mistake that people make with the law of cosines is they stop too early. Does anybody have an answer yet? Vic?
I don't know if this is right, but I got 30.53.
You couldn't have done that better if I asked you to.
Thank you.
Because that's not right. Okay, but you did exactly what almost all of these people will do. And I'll ask you, what did she do wrong?
You have to square it.
Not square it,
Square root.
square root it, right. So that's what I mean about stopping too early. Notice that this is a squared. So this value that she got of 30.53 is what a squared is. So when you take the square root, the actual answer is, Vic? 5 point something or another.
5.52.
Okay, we'll go with 5.5. Does that answer make sense? Is it reasonable? Yeah, I mean, 4 and 7, okay. So the other one being 5.5 is not unreasonable. Questions? Not a bad calculation. However, the nice thing about this is you should only ever have to do the law of cosines once in any problem. Notice, for instance, if I said, okay, now go and find angles B and C. I could do this new version of law of cosines that I'm going to show you in a second, but once I know what A is, I all of a sudden have that law of sines comparison that we need, the angle and the side opposite it. And I can do law of sines, because many of you will agree with me that law of sines is going to be a much easier calculation. Okay, questions? Easy peasy. Just remember a couple things. The angle on the right has to match the side on the left. And you're solving for A, not A squared. So make sure you take, the last thing you should do in this problem is take the square root of that final answer. Okay, doke. Next scenario. Oh, there's my answer. 5.5. Good job, Vicky. This is called the side scenario. Because I gave you all three sides, no angles. Madeline, without using the picture, because don't trust the picture, trust the numbers, which of those angles is the largest? D, O, or G? Why? You are correct. Why?
Because it's opposite is the largest.
Perfect. Which angle is the middle angle? Good, which would make D the smallest angle. Okay? Can you all do that? Yes? Because this last side scenario, you're going to have to be able to identify the largest angle. I'm not going to explain why this is true, but there are rules that there is a rule that needs to be followed here. And the rule is, in the side scenario, you must always find the biggest angle first. Okay? Find the biggest angle first, which means we're going to solve for O. And this is the ugly one. If I'm going to solve for angle O, that means I'm using the 19.7. And you'll remember 30 seconds ago I said the angle on the right has to match the side on the left. So I'm there, just to get it started. All right, then I've got 12.1 squared plus 8.8 squared. I don't know where that came from. Go away. Squared minus parentheses. I don't have enough room. 2 times 12.1 times 8.8 times the cosine of O. Okay, so there's the setup. And you can tell already that that's not going to be fun. I'll tell you what people do wrong first, so you don't do it. What people commonly do is they calculate this, they calculate that, and then they subtract those two. And that's really bad math. That's why there's parentheses there. So I'm going to show you the right way to do it so that you don't make the same mistake. And I'm going to do it without using a calculator because I'm going to wait till the very end and plug everything else in. Okay. So first things first. 19.7 squared minus 12.1 squared minus 8.8 squared is equal to the opposite of 2 times 12.1 times 8.8 times the cosine of 0. Now, realistically speaking, if I was doing this problem, I would take 2 times 12.1 times 8.8 and get that number. But again, I'm just going to work in generalities without a calculator. That stuff in front has to go to the other side. This is not a minus sign now, it's an opposite sign. So therefore, I'm going to divide by that whole mess. 19.7 squared minus 12.1 squared minus 8.8 squared divided by negative 2 times 12.1 times 8.8 equals the cosine of O. How do I get O by itself? Got to do an inverse cosine. That's not practical. You're not going to do that. You're going to use your calculator. You're going to take 19.7 minus 19.7 squared minus 12.1 squared minus 8.8 squared, enter. Then divide that number in parentheses by negative 2 times 12.1 times 8.8. This is not practical, but I wanted to show you how you do it so you don't make algebra mistakes. The last thing I would do is take an inverse cosine of that value on the calculator to get an answer. Any of you crazy kids have an answer for me? Martha, you have a question or an answer?
I'm kind of confused. Why did you write this line twice? And then
It's a new line.
And then what happened? How did you get cosine? Oh,
I treated this thing, that chunk of stuff, as one big animal. So this is multiplication, right? So I undid the multiplication by dividing that whole thing over to the bottom there.
Oh,
Okay? So if this helps, let me show you a different way to do it. Hopefully this won't confuse you. Sam, can I use your calculator? Thank you. Okay, realistically speaking, if I'm solving this problem, I would do the following. On my calculator, I'm doing 19.7 squared minus 12.1 squared minus 8.8 squared and getting an answer of 164.24. 164.24. Wow, that was crazy. 164.24 equals. Then I'm going to multiply this. Negative 2 times 12.1 times 8.8 is equal to negative 212.96 times the cosine of O. Okay, everybody with me? This stuff went over to there and gave me 164.24. This stuff multiplied together gave me that answer. Then I divide 164.24 divided by negative 212.96 equals an ugly fraction. Negative 0.077 blah, 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 which I would store into x. And then take the inverse cosine of both sides. Inverse cosine of that number x is equal to, I got 140.5. Thank you. And honestly, you're going to find that calculation fairly frustrating. I'll give you another tip here. When you do all this algebra and you get it down to this statement, some number equals the cosine of 0. This number has to be between negative 1 and 1. Otherwise, you'll get an error. So if you get an error, you did a calculation incorrectly. You know what? 140 point, I think it was 46. Questions? Do you agree that's an ugly calculation? Yes? Okay. Now, the nice thing is you don't ever have to do it more than once in a problem. Because now if I go on to find angle D or angle G, I'll talk about which one to find next, I'm going to use law of sines because I don't like that law of cosines. We found the largest angle first. We find the medium angle second. We find the smallest angle last. And the smallest angle is actually the easy one to find. So I would go and find angle G next. Vicki, question?
I'm confused on how you got negative 0.77.
I took 164.24 and divided by negative 212.96
Okay.
to get cosine by itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, almost done. Okay, again, solve for largest angle first. There's all my calculations. Bingo, same answer. Okay. Then, as I said, if you continue the calculations, you're going to solve for the middle angle next. So I would go and solve for angle G using the law of sines. And I know it's easy for me because I just swipe right and the answers appear, but you would do the same thing. By now, based on our homework demonstrations, I think you have a pretty firm grasp of the law of sines, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. And then I did D. Notice there's no calculations for D. How did I find angle D?
You O and G plus together minus, no, 180 minus O plus G.
Good. Yeah. Have we talked about this symbol, by the way? The 3 dots there? No, that means therefore. I don't know why you need to know that other than I used it in my slideshow. Okay, we're all done. Questions? Okay, so let's review. If you have an angle and the side opposite it, boom, law of sines. That's it. And right by now, you should realize the law of sines is an easier calculation than the law of cosines. Okay? If you can't use the law of sines, then you have to go to law of cosines. And I gave you some pointers about law of cosines. Remember, the angle on the right has to match the side on the left. Always solve for the biggest angle in the side, side, side scenario. The side angle, side scenario is pretty obvious which one you should solve for. Questions? Beautiful. Let's get after the day 6 homework. Don't forget we have a quiz on Tuesday which covers law of sines and law of cosines. Beautiful.
Wait, it was 100.
140.5.
Why do you have 140.4?
140.46.